Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. This is episode 26. It's pretty amazing that we've gotten this far, and I'm very, very excited to introduce to you Dr. Jeff Tarrant, author of the book Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain and founder of the Neuromeditation Institute. Thank you so much, Dr. Tarrant, for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, my goodness, I have been waiting for a book like this to come along, and I know it sounds like I'm like your business sales partner right now selling this thing, but it's rare that I fall in love with a book, and this is just right up my alley. And so I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit about your personal story and the genesis of this book, because it seems like you went through a whole bunch of training in different modalities just to get to this content and distill it down.
Yeah, actually, the way you said that is pretty accurate. It's my own personal journey has been kind of all over the board in some ways, and for a long time I felt like that was a problem or something that like I wasn't really getting deep into any one particular area, but rather sort of studying lots of things and felt like somehow maybe that was problematic or I was missing something. And it wasn't until kind of really working with this program that I sort of understood that it's like, oh, this is the culmination of studying all these different things, and that this probably wouldn't have happened had I just stayed with one tradition or with one particular practice. But what really happened is, probably for about the last 20 years or so, I've been heavily involved with both technology-based interventions as a psychologist, so neurofeedback, quantitative EEG analysis, but really other things as well, so transcranial magnetic stimulation and audiovisual entrainment, and pretty much if there's something that you can use to influence your nervous system, I use it from a technology perspective. But then I've also been involved in lots of different forms of contemplative practices, meditation and mindfulness and qigong and yoga and various other spiritual and meditative practices. And so really what this is sort of a marriage of these two areas and kind of bringing them together in a way that makes sense and helps us understand from a Western perspective, from a left brain perspective, like what's really going on when we're engaged in these various meditative states or contemplative states. And how can we use that information? How can we bridge it together so that it actually adds to the practices? So it's not really about trying to say, trying to boil all of these ancient practices down to, it's just chemicals and it's like, that's not really what it's about, but it's about how can we take what we know in the 21st century about our brain and how we work as humans and add that to the collective, knowledge that is, that we've been working with for thousands of years. And how can that work together in sort of a synthesis that is additive rather than, sort of like one's better than the other or trying to sort of, replace something. That's not really what it's about. It's like, how can we bring it all together? I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense. And what you do really well in the book is, brain maps and intakes and symptomology kind of related in this realm will do better with this kind of meditation, or it will be more therapeutic if you do this kind of meditation, or it may be increasing a pathology if you do a specific kind of meditation. And this is really, with the amount of people now moving into meditation, this filtering process, it's like the Google of the internet when Google first came online. You know what I'm saying? Because it was like thousands and then millions and then billions of pages. And how do you sort through all that to figure out what's going to work?
Yeah. So, the basic kind of premise of the book and the work that we're doing is that not all meditations are the same. And, that's really, that's the basis of the whole idea, is that And for me, when I figured that out, it was sort of a revelation, because it still gets talked about in many circles and many books as if all meditations do the same thing or have the same effect. Or you'll hear people say mindfulness is good for everything, or TM is good for everything. Or you'll read something that say meditation increases alpha brain waves, as if meditation is one thing and they all do the same thing. But when you start to investigate it, it's very clear that that's not accurate. That depending on how you're using your attention, how you're directing your attention, and what your intention is, it changes the way the brain becomes active or quiet in different regions. So it changes the patterning of the brain activation, which makes sense. I mean, if you change the way you're paying attention, doesn't it make sense that would change the way your brain engages? I mean, from a logical perspective, it's like, oh, well, that makes sense. And now we know that that's exactly what happens. And because of that, because the brain is engaging in different ways, it has different implications for different mental health concerns. Because same thing, different mental health issues impact the brain differently. So we're getting to a point where we can literally start to figure out, well, why are you meditating? What is your goal? And can we identify a specific practice that might be best for you? So it's an individualized kind of approach, to meditation.
Let's start by defining meditation in a very broad sense, because if you're very reductionist about your view on it, meditation is this particular lineage or...
Yeah, so I mean, we came up with a definition that we use in the book that I like, and I think it works pretty well. Hopefully I can repeat it without it being in front of me. But basically we talk about meditation as mental training. And that's the short definition, mental training, but mental training as a specific tool to challenge the habitual ways that we pay attention, that we perceive the world, ways that we think, ways that we feel. And so I like thinking of it in that way because it's very secular. You don't have to believe anything. You don't have to engage in a specific spiritual or religious belief system. Anybody can benefit from this because you're really challenging the way that the mind creates its understanding of the world. And so for me, it's really about using meditation as a psychology tool. And of course, a lot of religious scholars argue that Buddhism is actually a psychology anyway, that it's not really a religion, it's actually a psychology, because you're dealing with how the mind creates suffering and how the mind can alleviate suffering. And so we're really tackling that by saying, well, okay, how are we doing that? Well, we're doing that by challenging the habitual ways that the mind works. The habitual ways create suffering, and we can challenge that. And we do that through specific ways of changing the way we pay attention and what our intention is.
And on the other side of this, so sort of the neuroscience EEG perspective, can you give the listeners a 101 on what you measure and what some of these different metrics mean, if that makes sense?
Sure, yeah. So the brain imaging work that I do is all EEG based. So it's measuring the electrical activity of the brain. And so there's lots of different ways to measure brain activation patterns. A lot of the stuff, the fancy stuff out there, fMRIs and things like that, they're looking at, blood flow patterns and things like that, to see what areas show increased blood flow. And because if a certain area shows more blood flow, we're assuming that it's more active. There's something going on there. EEG works in a similar way, but actually I find it to be a little bit more finessed, because rather than saying it's an increase of blood flow, it's a decrease of blood flow. It's like, well, what types of frequencies are present and how much and how are those changing? And so it's not just one variable, it's a lot of variables. And so for me, it helps gain it's a better tool for understanding consciousness. Because, for example, the brain is constantly making everywhere, all over the brain, it's making slow brain waves. And by slow, we're talking about how many cycles per second there are. It's the same exact metrics used to talk about any kind of electricity. If you're talking about electricity coming out of a wall socket, it's the exact same concept. So, for instance, coming out of the wall socket is 60 hertz, at least in the United States, 60 cycles per second. So there's 60 repetitions in 1 second of time. That's how fast that current is. Well, your brain makes 60 hertz, and your brain makes 1 hertz, and it makes 10 hertz, and it makes 100 hertz. It makes all of the frequencies. We actually don't know how fast it goes. As we develop more sophisticated technology, guess what? We figure out, it goes even faster than we thought. Well, yeah.
How high has it been clocked at this point? How fast?
Actually, you know what? I don't even know. It's a great question, but most researchers stop paying attention. Actually, most researchers stop paying attention after about 50. But I've seen some studies recently where they look up to 100, 120 hertz. But most of the standard equipment doesn't go. My equipment only goes up to 80. So like the equipment at this point isn't even designed to measure anything faster than that. And so we don't know. We don't know how fast the brain actually can go. But we do know it's producing all of these frequencies all the time, everywhere. And so that's a tremendous amount of information. And so what influences our state of consciousness is how much of each of these frequencies is present in a given location at any given time. So if you have a lot of slow brain waves, so things like, this is the terminology most people are familiar with. You talk about delta waves or theta waves or alpha waves, things like that. Delta, theta, and alpha are all essentially slow brain waves. And if you have a lot of slow brain waves in a particular region, that region is usually pretty quiet. There's not much going on there. And I'm oversimplifying this dramatically, but to sort of get the basic idea. And then if you have a lot of fast brain waves, so things like beta or high beta or gamma, then that region is more activated. And so you can see depending on what's going on, the proportion of each of these brain waves, it shifts around and it moves. And so what we see in different states of meditation is that it's not all about alpha, which is what we used to think. And that's what we used to talk about. And actually, I think there's a reason for that. But now we're seeing that actually some states of meditation are activating the fastest brain waves. Gamma, the research by Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin with the Tibetan monks, that's what he found, is that Tibetan monks, when they're engaged in a compassion meditation, they show up to 3 times the amount of gamma. Gamma is the fastest brainwave we look at, compared to a control group. So these are monks, and they're not showing slow brainwaves. They're showing ridiculously fast brainwaves. So this really changes the whole way that we think about what meditation is. We have to kind of shift the way that our old school sort of thinking about, it's like, it's a deep state of of consciousness, and you have these very slow brain waves. And it's like, well, sometimes. And sometimes you have ridiculously fast brain waves. Depends on what you're doing.
Right, yeah. So talk about the 4 styles of neuromeditation and how you define them and how you end up sorting people.
Sure. So the 4 styles that we most often talk about are focus, mindfulness, open heart, and quiet mind. And we came up with these styles. So I say we came up. It wasn't like I just sort of made this up. I didn't just sort of I didn't wake up from a dream and sort of understand that there were these 4 styles. I mean, this is all based on research literature. So the big article, this isn't the only one, but this is what got me started, was an article by Travis and Shear in 2010. And what they did in this research article was they went out into the literature and they pulled every study they could find looking at EEG, brainwave patterns with meditation. And there are mountains of studies that look at this, just a ridiculous number. So they pulled all these studies, and their only goal in this kind of research that they did was to see if they could find any patterns. So, you were talking about all of the different traditions of meditation, and there's thousands of traditions of meditation. And so if you look at the research literature, and they're talking about Kundalini yoga versus Qigong versus loving kindness versus, you're looking at all of these, it's overwhelming because there's so many traditions. And even within a tradition, there's lots of different ways to meditate. So that's not a useful way from a scientific perspective to understand meditation. You get lost quick. And so what Travis and Scheer did was simply look and say, well, are there any obvious patterns with brain waves that we see across all of these studies? And they essentially identified 3 patterns. And so the terms they came up with for those 3 categories were focused attention, open monitoring, and automatic self-transcending. In fact, that's in the title of the article. And so they identified these 3 patterns from lots and lots of research that's been done. So that was kind of our starting point, was to say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And, we kind of changed the names a little bit, really just to make it more user-friendly. Because, something like automatic self-transcending, that's not going to mean much to your average person. But if you say quiet mind, it immediately sort of creates sort of an idea of what we're talking about. So we really just kind of changed some of the languaging to make it easier to use. But so focus, let's start with focus. And a focus style of meditation is most people are going to be familiar with. Anybody who's ever tried to meditate, that's probably what they were introduced to. There's a single target for your attention. Maybe it's the breath, or maybe it's a mantra, just a word or a phrase that you use over and over to hold your attention. And the goal of the meditation is to hold your attention on this single target, and the mind wanders, and you recognize that the mind wandered, and then you gently, patiently, non-judgmentally bring your attention back to the single target. And that's it. And so there's a lot of ways to practice that. Like even what I just said, you can do that with your breath. Even with your breath, there's multiple ways to do a focused meditation with the breath. Or a mantra, or an image of the Buddha, or a mandala, or whatever. There's a lot of ways to practice a focused meditation. And what Travis and Scheer discovered was that, to a large degree, it doesn't really matter what your target is. If the way you're directing your attention fits into this category, your brain pattern is going to be very, very similar. And it's an active pattern. This isn't an alpha pattern either. And this is what they found, is that people, there's an increase of beta 2 and or gamma brain waves when somebody is engaged in a focused meditation. And it makes sense because this is a very active state of consciousness. You are actively holding your attention on a specific target. It's not relaxing. It's not floating off in space. It's holding the attention and not letting it waver. That's a very active process, so you need active brain waves. Mindfulness, we called it mindfulness. They called it open monitoring. And again, the reason we chose to call it mindfulness was first because the definition they use for open monitoring is identical to the definition that most people use for mindfulness, including John Kabat-Zinn, who is created the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And so again, it just made more sense from a practical standpoint to let's just call it mindfulness. Now, I should say too that there's a lot of discussion right now about what is mindfulness. Mindfulness is one of those things now that everybody's talking about it, and which is great. But of course, the more people talk about it, the messier it gets. So we're running into that a bit. So we do define it as carefully as we can. And so mindfulness is it's a different way of paying attention. It's a soft, gentle, allowing way of paying attention. You're You're allowing whatever is present to be there in the present moment without attaching to it, without pushing it away. You're just accepting things for what they are and letting them go. And when you think about that definition compared to the focus, that's a very different way of paying attention. And because of that, the brain is doing something different. In fact, the same regions that are activated in a focus meditation become quiet in a mindfulness meditation. So there's an increase of theta. Theta is a slow brain wave. So you're still paying attention, but you're paying attention in a totally different way. You're paying attention in this relaxed, allowing, gentle, non-judging, present moment way. And so the brain looks different. The third one is open heart. So that's kind of a generic, we're using that as a generic umbrella term to capture any of the practices that involve activating a positive emotional state. Now, so Travis and Shear, they didn't have this category. This is one we added on from Travis and Shear. And it's interesting because it's not like there's not a lot of research on this. There's a lot on, especially on loving kindness. There's a lot of research. But what Travis and Shear did was they lumped this in with the focus category, with focused attention. And the reason that they did that is because their primary interest was looking at specific brain waves. And the brain waves involved in open heart are the same brain waves as involved in a focused meditation. It's gamma. So they just put them all into one category because that's what they're interested in. We felt like it deserved its own category because not only is the way that you're directing your attention different in a loving kindness or compassion practice, but the regions of the brain that are activated are not the same as a focused meditation. So there's some overlap, but there's also some significant differences. And so we felt like it deserved its own category. And again, you know, other researchers are using this as its own category as well. So again, it's not just us, but you know, there's a lot of research that's happening now where they're comparing loving kindness to focus specifically. And so you can see that they're not exactly the same and they should be treated separate.
Yeah, and just on that note, 2 interviews ago, we spoke to Roland McCready at HeartMath.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad that you included open heart because it gives a presence to emotionality when it comes to sitting. And like, is anyone not walking around with emotions? Is anyone not dealing with that in consciousness? I mean, it's like this, it's sort of like this gigantic hole that no one's talking about. So I'm so glad you brought that in.
Yeah. And you know, it's funny that some, you know, researchers or people that talk about meditation don't include that because, you know, if you think of all the practices, you know, the compassion, the loving kindness, but then even things like forgiveness or gratitude, like all of those practices, it's like, well, where do they fit? And, you know,
would you say prayer would fit into this category?
I think prayer can fit into this category. So for me, things like prayer are complicated because prayer could involve a lot of different elements. And so I think that's the issue. You know, we're always talking about how are you directing your attention and what is your intention? And for me, that's what makes the difference. So for instance, if I'm, you know, when I meditate most mornings, it's usually a spiritual practice for me. It doesn't have to be a spiritual practice, but for me it is because I have my own, you know, belief system and my own structure around that. And if I'm engaged in something that I would call prayer, it is very often what I would think of as an open heart practice, you know, where I'm intentionally trying to engage in this loving, open kind of feeling, and perhaps I'm trying to connect to my higher self or something else. But it's that heart activation is really the key, and so, you know, that's not present in some styles of meditation. If I'm just focusing on a candle flame, there doesn't really have to be any emotion involved there. I mean, something might come up spontaneously, but that's not really the point of the meditation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't mean to detract from your. Were you done with open heart, or were you ready to move on to? Do we cover? No, automatic self-transcending was the other category.
Yeah.
Mouthful.
Yeah, it is a mouthful. Which actually I really like the name because it says a lot. Automatic self-transcending. Really, what they're conveying there in 3 words, or is that 2 words? I don't know how that's categorized. But the first part, it's automatic. It's an automatic process. And so we call this quiet mind. And this is sort of the stereotype of meditation, that you're supposed to somehow have nothing going on. You just empty your mind of thoughts, and it's this spacious, empty awareness, and there are meditative styles where that's kind of where you're going. For instance, Zen, a lot of Zen practices is kind of that state, transcendental meditation. So TM is the biggie. In fact, Travis, so, I keep talking about Travis and Shear, but so Travis of Travis and Shear is a big TM guy. All of his research has been in the TM world. And so it's not a big surprise that they created a category basically for TM. Automatic self-transcending is largely to take care of transcendental meditation. And what you see in TM, but also with a lot of Zen practices, is that where you are going in the practice is this quiet state where there's sort of not much going on internally. And that's a nice state to be in. That's a very slow brainwave state because you're really shutting everything down. And that is the one meditation pattern that is represented by alpha. So, I was picking on alpha before, that it's like everybody's, I came up in neurofeedback, and when I came up, that's what everybody was saying. Oh, meditation is increased alpha. And so that's what I did for myself for years. I'd put an electrode on the back of my head, and I'd sit down to meditate, and I'd have it, give me some reward signal whenever my alpha was above a certain level. And assuming that this is meditation, this is what's supposed to happen. And I didn't know any better. And, of course, what I figured out much later is that I've already got a ridiculous amount of alpha, and I don't need any more alpha. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And so this kind of gets to one of your points that you made at the beginning, that, sort of when we start to look at it this way, you can actually start to identify where certain practices may not be particularly good for certain individuals. And this is one example of that if you already have a slow brain, it may not be a great idea to engage in practices that enhance slow brainwave activity. It's just kind of aggravating a situation rather than providing balance.
Most of the folks that I come across are entering meditation now, not from I don't even know how to say this, but it was like pathological state, but it's almost like there's a spectrum, right? That you're not pathological and then normal. There's sort of a spectrum that people lay upon, and you would even have tendencies. So let's just say, in the example that you gave about having already a lot of alpha, if you were to just increase your alpha, at a certain point, this would be a pathological state. Would you agree? Or it would be clinically identified as one?
I would say, I would just qualify that a little bit and say, could become a pathological state. So I'll pick on myself because that's an easy thing to do. I already said that I've got a lot of alpha. I've got a lot of slow brainwave activity, and that by itself is not necessarily a problem. But what it does is it predisposes me to things like ADHD or depression, because those are both slow brainwave pathologies. So I have a tendency to go in those directions because I already have a bunch of slow brain waves. So So if I'm adding a bunch of slow brain waves, it doesn't necessarily say I'm going to become depressed. But boy, you're kind of stacking the cards in that direction. It's like, and so this is why, like, if you look at, like, let's pick on those two things. So ADHD. So somebody who truly has ADHD, a stereotypical brainwave pattern, they have too much slow brainwave activity. And so what do we do for that? Well, we stimulate the brain. They take stimulants because it is a counterbalance to having an under-aroused, slow brain. So, we need a balance in order to function optimally. Or, if people aren't taking medications, they still have to find things to activate the brain. They exercise, they move, they might drink a bunch of caffeine, they seek stimulation. All of those things are ways to compensate for having a slow brain pattern. So if instead I just sat down and did nothing, ate crappy food that increased slow brainwave activity, and didn't exercise, increased slow brainwave activity, and didn't get enough sleep, increased slow brainwave activity, all I'm doing is aggravating my brain's tendency.
Can you give some other examples of some problems that you might see with slow brainwave activities that people could recognize?
Yeah, I mean, the biggies are depression and ADHD. Those are the biggies. But it can also look like, really any kind of cognitive problem, could be connected to a slow brainwave issue. So this happens sometimes as people get older. As we get older, the brain starts to slow down. And you'll start to see, not always, but, you'll see some cognitive decline that happens, memory issues, things like that, or, a slowing down of the reaction time, things like that. And so, that can be a slow brain kind of a problem. A lot of times if somebody has a head injury, there's a lot of talk now about concussions and, traumatic brain injuries. That will often lead to increased slow brainwave activity in different regions. So then you'll see those people, they have a hard time paying attention. They have a hard time managing their emotions, things like that. So those are the big things that we see with slow brain waves. You can also see learning disabilities. So some of it depends on where the slow brainwave activity is popping up at. Is it popping up in the frontal lobes, or is it popping up, toward the back of the head? Basically, if there's too much slow brainwave activity, it can be associated with all kinds of things. It just depends on where it's located. Because basically what it means is that region of the brain is not behaving as efficiently as we would like if there's a bunch of slow activity there. If it's always there, if it's there periodically or at certain times, that's probably not an issue, because that means the brain is flexible. That's what we want. That's what I think the ultimate goal is. And I think that's what meditation can ultimately provide, is a brain that is flexible, that can move in and out of states at will and not get stuck in certain patterns. That's what happens with depression, is the brain gets stuck in a pattern and it's always there. Or anxiety, the exact opposite. So it's a fast brain issue, right? There's too much fast brainwave activity and it never goes away. And so, the person is stuck in this loop. And so how can we break that pattern? This goes back to the definition of meditation, challenging the habitual ways that we pay attention, that we think, that we perceive, that we feel. Because the brain does it. That's what it does. It's a pattern making machine, and it will just get in these ruts, and if left unchecked, it will often cause problems. So how can we help it to be flexible, to be loose, to not get in that autopilot?
So you mentioned anxiety. We can put this in the category of overarousal, correct? Versus underarousal. Give us some other examples of overarousal or symptoms.
So, I mean, again, it depends a little bit on where it's going to show up. But, even something like pain, can show up as over-arousal. Physical pain can show up. Migraines can show up as over-arousal. But if you kind of break down all of the symptoms associated with anxiety, it gives you a broader picture in terms of, like worry or rumination or panic or nervousness. All of those little components are typically associated with an over-aroused state. Sleep problems can often be associated with over-arousal. You think of somebody who lays in bed and they can't fall asleep. They're exhausted, and they're just laying there awake. And it's like, well, what's going on? It's like, well, the brain is over-aroused and it can't downshift. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you be able to put stress, just kind of like chronic stress in that area, so overdoing in that over-arousal category?
Yeah, it's interesting. Chronic stress actually looks identical to anxiety in the brain. It's interesting because we're actually working on a research study right now looking at chronic stress and anxiety and seeing if we can use a mindfulness in nature virtual reality experience to break up that pattern. Because that's exactly what we're talking about. Like, how can we disrupt these patterns? Sometimes you can do it passively, but then, again, meditation kind of is more of an active way to do that, of learning how to sort of disengage or engage depending on what you need.
I think it'd be prudent to talk for just a little bit about the default mode network, what that is, where it is in the brain, and you do mention this in the book, and maybe an intervention for that, meditation intervention for that.
Yeah, the default mode network, that's kind of the key in the brain. I mean, if there's one brain area to talk about with meditation, it's the default mode network. And so, as its name implies, again, I love it when the name tells you so much. It's like automatic self-transcending. It's like, well, that pretty much tells you everything you need. Default mode network, it tells you a lot. It's a network. So it's not just one brain region. It's several brain regions working together. And that's how the brain works. We like to talk about a specific location in the brain and say, this area does this. And sometimes that's true, but more often than not, there's multiple brain regions working together to accomplish a task. And that's the case with the default mode network. So the largest chunk of the default mode network, the hub, is toward the back of the head, kind of down the center line, but toward the back. So, right where the head kind of curves toward the back of your head, kind of thinking in that region. And if you dig down into the brain just a little bit, go below the surface, so not right on the very top of the brain, but go down, a few centimeters, you run into some regions of the brain called the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus. You'll see both of those terms. They're basically right on top of each other, and those are the hub of the default mode network. Okay, so what does the default mode network do? Well, again, it's our default mode. So this is what your brain does when it's not doing something else. So if you are engaged in some sort of active task, so you're working on a project, you're working on a paper, you're writing music, you are focused on a specific thing. And at that time, when you're focused on something external, your default mode network is pretty quiet. There's not much going on. But as soon as you stop, as soon as you take a break from what you're doing, and if you kind of think about your own experience, you'll recognize this right away. As soon as you take a break, your mind on its own starts thinking about how hungry it is, and that you have to go to the bathroom, and that you forgot to call your kids, and your laundry list of things that you forgot to accomplish, all of these things. So all of these different mental tasks that pop up automatically, that's your default mode network at work. So the default mode network is really about you thinking about yourself. So they talk about it as self-referencing or self-processing. So you're thinking about you in some form or fashion. That's what the default mode network does. And so it's interesting that this is a huge region, a huge network in the brain. It uses a tremendous amount of energy. That hub of the default mode network uses 40% more energy than other regions in the brain. So, partly this is really, I think, useful because what it helps us understand is that it's natural, it's normal. This is what the brain does, is it thinks about itself. Actually what it's doing more and more, they're looking at this region as kind of the seat of the ego, if you want to think of it that way. It's us creating an identity. So we're constantly looking at ourselves, comparing ourselves to others, judging ourselves, thinking about the past, memories. All of that is the default mode network doing its job. And so it's really creating your idea of this is who I am. And so if you think about that for a minute, that becomes really interesting from a mental health perspective, because how much of mental health relates to having a poor view of yourself or a distorted view of yourself or an incorrect view of yourself. And that drives how you feel and how you think and how you behave, this sort of faulty identity. And so if you think about that for a minute, it's like we actually know this from a lot of research that the default mode network is implicated in all kinds of mental health problems. It gets overactivated. And so guess what happens in most styles of meditation? You're shutting down the default mode network. So you're quieting that down. So this is true with focus meditation. It's true with quiet mind meditation. It's actually a little bit different with mindfulness. And I'm not actually aware of research that looks at it with open heart. Open heart and mindfulness are a little bit different because you are engaging the default mode network. You're thinking about yourself or things in reference to yourself, but you're doing it in a different way. So it's not judging, right? I mean, that's the whole point with mindfulness. It's non-judging, right? It's non-comparing. You're just allowing, but you're still reflecting on yourself. You're looking at your thoughts. You're looking at your feelings. You're looking at your bodily sensations, but you're doing it in a different way. So the default mode network is still engaged, but it's not engaged in kind of a problematic way. But with focus and quiet mind, you're just shutting that sucker down, which I think is largely why those forms of meditation are so powerful, because you're interrupting the selfing.
The selfing. I like that.
Yeah.
Talk to us about neurofeedback and its and how you use this to support meditation, and what you see there. I mean, this is I'm really excited about this. I just got my gear, arrived a couple days ago. I'm ready to go.
Nice.
I'm ready to go.
Excellent. Awesome. That's actually how I got started in this whole thing, was through neurofeedback. And, for listeners who aren't already familiar, neurofeedback is, it's a technology that allows you to measure brainwave activity and then turn it into some sort of auditory or visual feedback so that somebody gets information about what their brain is doing. And in doing that, you can learn to change the way your brain functions because you're getting direct information about what it's doing. And so we've used this in the field that I'm in for mental health for a long time because of exactly what we've been talking about. If a brain is under-aroused, if it's over-aroused, if it's stuck in a pattern, we can teach the brain through neurofeedback to do something different. And so, and again, it's not a big leap if you're already doing that to say, oh, well, how does this connect to meditation? And so, I gave the example of in my early days, I'd hook myself up and measure my alpha in the back of the head and say, oh, yeah, I'll try and increase my alpha because that's meditation. And so what we have done now, because we've identified these different styles, is we have created very specific protocols. So a protocol is basically a settings that you can create within a neurofeedback system to kind of tell it what to do. And so, for example, to pick something fairly straightforward, let's talk about a focus protocol. So my main focus protocol is to reward gamma activity in the front part of the brain, in the anterior cingulate. And so the anterior cingulate, it's right down the midline, right on the forehead basically, but deeper down. And that area of the brain becomes active anytime you are focused, anytime you're paying attention. If you're sustaining your attention, that area is going to be active. Now, so that's part of the equation, because that's partly what you're doing in a focus meditation is you're sustaining your attention. But here's the tricky part, is that you could be focused on anything. You could be ruminating, and you would have an active anterior cingulate. So just looking at that by itself isn't enough, because we don't know what the content is. So what focusing on the anterior cingulate allows us to do is to determine if somebody is actually engaged. So this is a way for us to check if somebody starts floating off in space. You know, sometimes people will start meditating and they start off with a focus, and the next thing you know, they're gone. They're off in space somewhere and they're floating around. Well, we don't want that. We want them to stay present and to stay whatever the content is. And so that's what that tells us. Now, at the same time, we can measure and monitor that default mode network. And because the default mode network is going to give us information about whether they are thinking about themselves or not, basically. And so we want the default mode network to be quiet, because if it's active, it means I'm thinking about myself, which means I'm not focused on my breath. It means I'm thinking about lunch, and I'm thinking about my laundry list, and I'm thinking about everything else. So we measure the default mode network as well. And what we look at there is alpha, because alpha is associated with a quiet state. So when the default mode network is quiet and the anterior cingulate is active, at the same time that I'm trying to meditate, I pretty much know what's going on. I know that I'm in the right state. So what we can do is we can measure this, and when this happens, we provide the computer provides a reward signal, or what we use is music. So we'll play some ambient music that's connected to these signals. So when your brain's doing what we want, it plays this nice background space music or whatever. And so that's your signal. You're meditating, and all of a sudden you're getting this signal that says, that's it, stay there, just hold that. And as soon as you get distracted and start thinking about something else, then your brainwaves shift, the music cuts out. It's an immediate signal. So think about when you're meditating, think about what normally happens. You're focused on something, and then you space out, and you could be spaced out in storyland for 5 or 6 or 10 minutes before you actually realize that you're not meditating. You know, it's like, who knows how long you've been gone? And we've all experienced that, you know.
Yep.
Well, with this, literally, you get feedback within a second of your mind spacing out that says, hey, where'd you go? And so you're called back. And so then you can bring yourself, it's like, oh, right, breath, back to your breath, and hold that. And what these systems allow you to do, it allows you to become aware of very subtle movements of the mind that normally you have no awareness of. Normally what we're dealing with is sort of gross movements of the mind, you know, these big things. But when you have this kind of feedback, you start noticing all these tiny little fluctuations. And so you get really good at learning how to navigate your own internal state, which is what it's all about. So, you know, we call it EEG neuromeditation. And, you know, it's not necessary to use the things that we've been talking about today. You don't have to have the equipment, but boy, it sure helps. You know, it's a massive tool. And so, you know, you have to do that individually with folks. And so, you know, that's another part of kind of what we do here is I have clients throughout the day that will do private EEG neuromeditation sessions, but then we also teach classes, for the community that don't involve that. So we can talk about the concepts and the science and teach people about this and how to use it, but you don't have to be hooked up. So you can use it both ways.
So cool. All right. Can we touch on I got so many questions, but I know we're running out of time here. Can we talk for a moment about neurofeedback and or meditation as it relates to peak performance, which is sort of gaining some traction out there in the world?
Yeah. There's and that's not my exact focus. I mean, I know a little bit about it, and there's people that's their whole thing. Working with elite athletes in particular. And it's funny because the United States is just figuring this out, but other countries have been doing this with their elite athletes for decades. Canada, Russia, Germany, they've been doing this stuff for a long time, and we're just kind of getting on board. Although at the last Summer Olympics, I can never remember their names. The sand volleyball, Misty Trainer, and whoever the other one. Anyway, they were doing neurofeedback as part of their training, and so it's starting to kind of get more mainstream, and people are hearing more about it. And so, a little bit of it depends. So usually, what they're doing is to increase focus or flexibility of attention. Can you go from a laser focus to a relaxed open focus, and back to a laser focus, and back to a relaxed open focus? So, training your attention circuits, to be able to shift in and out very easily, or to be able to really zone in and not become distracted at all, which is super important. If you think about that from a peak performance standpoint, you need to be able to only pay attention to what's going on right now and tune everything else out. Tune out the crowd, tune out the butterflies in your stomach, tune out the judge, whatever. It's like just focus on you and what's happening in the moment. And so we can train that. You can also train, arousal management, right? So that's another big issue. I actually, back when I used to be at the University of Missouri, I did some work with the athletic department there, and there was they had a really nice sports psych program, and one of the doc students that I was working with, he was a swimming and diving assistant coach, and he had actually made it into the Olympic trials, and got into the trials. And he told this story, right, where he gets up there for his event, and I'm not a swimming guy, so I'm going to probably get the terminology all wrong, but he gets up there and looks over, and Michael Phelps is like right next to him, and so he like totally freaks, and it was like his worst swim ever, and it was all because of nerves. It had nothing to do with his ability. He was capable, but his nerves got him, and he couldn't do it. And so, learning how to manage that, learning how to sort of shift your arousal networks or downshift them at will, is critical. So, those are two elements of how you could sort of, do a peak performance training.
Let's talk about some non-meditative, non-neurofeedback interventions. You mentioned you kind of sprinkled them throughout the book at the ends of each chapter that will help for various scenarios. I love your talk about the Mondolinth.
It's a tool that was created by this woman that I met several years ago at a conference, and it's basically she uses Celtic designs primarily. But, so she made up the word mandolin. So it's a combination of a mandala and a labyrinth. And basically the idea is that you simply, you trace this design. You can use your finger, or you can use a pen, or you can use, a chopstick or whatever. And you basically, all you do is trace. And so it is, some of the designs are very tight. So they're tightly woven. You have to it requires a lot of focus and attention. Others of them are very loose. And so you can be much more flowing and fluid in how you're sort of moving. So it's interesting because it involves visual attention, but also, it involves the body because you're bringing the hand and eye movement in, and it's these fluid flowing movements. And so you can actually use these for a lot of different things. Usually we talk about it in relation to stress and anxiety. And it's really interesting because, this is one of those where we mapped a handful of people, brain mapped them while they were doing this. And we specifically chose people who were anxious to begin with because we wanted to see, well, what happens in the brain? Actually, when I first met this woman, she was telling me all these things, right? Like, oh, it does this to the brain or whatever. But it had never been measured. And so like, well, let's look at this. Let's actually look at it. And boy, if she wasn't right, she was going just by her subjective, watching people do this and sort of watching how they relaxed and what they reported. And so she was kind of extrapolating from that and saying like, oh, it must be, increasing slow brain waves or whatever. And it doesn't always increase slow brain waves, but it definitely quiets the brain. And it does it over and over and over. So this repetitive, flowing, fluid motion. And then if you take that and you combine it with one of the meditation styles, so usually we think of it as sort of a mindfulness thing. Can you just be in the present moment? Can you just trace the mandolin? Can you just focusing on the fluidity and flowing and ease and what it feels like in the hand and, how that feels in the body? Like just being present with that, but kind of giving you something to do. We've seen this work with people who are really pretty severe in terms of there's a person that that's kind of going through our certification process. She's in Canada, and she works with really serious PTSD in war vets. And like these are guys who can't leave the house. They're so distressed. And she's using the mandolin with them and finds that it works. It's like, so it's not just about what we like about this is it kind of starts to break up the stereotype of what meditation is. This idea that you have to sit on a cushion and you have to hold your hands in a certain mudra and you have to have, prayer beads and you have to have candles. And, it's like, you don't need any of that stuff from our perspective, because from our perspective, it's about how are you using your mind, and the rest is sort of like can be helpful. I mean, I think it's helpful to have those things if that's, creating an environment, creating a set and a setting to facilitate your mental state. But that's what it's about. How can you help a person get into the right mental state? And in this case, giving them something concrete to do with their body, with their hands, can really be a big assist. And same with now the essential oils are a little bit different because this is one of those things I was talking about, passive versus active. And essential oils is kind of passive. I mean, what? You smell an oil and what? That's it. You don't have to do anything. But it's interesting because we've got some data on this too. And, different oils affect different people differently. It's interesting, but one of the oils that we have looked at pretty consistently that we really like is frankincense. And, frankincense, people seem to have a really positive response to it, quiets things down really quick. And again, we've done some brain imaging with this. And one of the people, she was great. One of our first volunteers, she actually put a couple of drops of it on her tongue. And it was instantaneous. I mean, the change in brain waves was immediate. And so, again, it's like being aware of some of these things. It's not all, some people look at that and like, oh, essential oils, oh, that's voodoo, or that's some sort of wacky, crazy. And it's like, no, it's not. It's, there are components in the oil. It's a plant. It's from a plant. What the heck do you think medicines are made out of? It's like, it makes sense that we are influenced and affected by the different components in these different oils, and they have different impacts. And so, it needs to be studied more, but there's actually some good science out there around it. And again, it's another tool. Like, what are you trying to do? Do you need to quiet your system down? Well, then use tools that are going to do that. Maybe it's a mandolant, maybe it's an essential oil, but it's nudging your nervous system in the same direction. And the more tools you can find that are going to be working toward the same end, the more successful you're going to be.
You mentioned audiovisual entrainment as like one of these things. Yes, sometimes it works, and it depends. Scenario, can you briefly discuss that? Basically like flashing lights and beeping sounds or binaural beats and stuff like that?
Yeah. So audiovisual entrainment, I like audiovisual entrainment a lot. And there's a company, I'll give them a plug real quick. There's a company I really like, and again in Canada. What's with the Canada connection? And the company's called Mind Alive. And I've been working with this company for a long time, and I really like their products, and I like what they're up to. And so audiovisual entrainment is basically you've got these glasses that you put on that have lights built into the eye set, and then you put headphones on, and there are tones in the headphones. And usually these are, you mentioned binaural beats, but usually what they're using are isochronic tones. And so what these are, they're just repetitive tones. So it's, do, 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 kind of like that. And the basic idea is that if you flash lights at a certain frequency, or you put repetitive tones in the ears at a certain frequency, the brain will start to match that. That's kind of the theory. And, what I kind of mentioned in the book is that you were kind of pointing at is that it doesn't always work that way for everybody. You would think it would. And for some people it does. If you pulse at an alpha frequency, so that's the way that we usually talk about it and use it, right? Is somebody's trying to increase alpha because alpha is associated with a relaxed internal state, a quiet state. And so, you can pulse 10 hertz into the eyes and into the ears. The brain will start to follow it. That's the entrainment part. And so you start to see increases of alpha in the person. Now that happens, and it happens enough to make it worth pursuing. And there are some instances where people have a different response to it. And so that's the part that's a little bit tricky, is that you never really know. It's an individual kind of thing. So one of the things I like about the AVE, the audiovisual entrainment, is that, if you buy one of those units, it comes preset with, 16 different programs or something. And what I will usually encourage people to do is start with like an alpha program, try it, and document, how did you feel afterwards? The nice thing about audiovisual entrainment is, almost immediately what the impact was. It's not like you have to wait for a week or a month to see what the impact is. Almost instantaneously. Did it make you feel better? Did it make you feel worse? Did you feel more alert? Did you feel sleepy? And you can start to figure out by experimenting a little bit which protocols are going to be best for you. And so to some degree, you don't have to necessarily do a brain map every time you hook yourself up for audiovisual entrainment. You can actually, if you pay attention, you can start to kind of figure out aha, I know this one is designed for XYZ. Is that how it makes me feel? Yeah. And, maybe there's 3 programs in that same category. Is one better than another for you? And again, this is what we emphasize in our program, is this sort of individual differences, that it's we're not the same. None of us are the same. And so why would we expect that the same meditation is going to impact us all the same, or the same audiovisual entrainment program is going to impact us all the same? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And so, for me, it's exciting that the science is finally there to sort of confirm this and say, look, we can be smart about this. We don't have to just kind of do a one size fits all. We can figure it out. And we can figure it out by measuring brainwaves, or we can figure it out by just kind of paying attention and trusting ourselves. This is a big thing that we see all the time. People don't trust themselves. They want somebody to tell them what the answer is. And I really try to avoid that as much as I can, and it's and say, look, I've got ideas, but you need to try some things and figure it out, like what works for you and what doesn't work. And that's okay. Like, can we accept that? And listen to ourselves. Maybe I'm big on that because, I'm still figuring out how to listen to myself, but I think that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah. Well, Dr. Tarrant, tell listeners how they can learn more about you. I know you've got workshops, trainings, all kinds of cool stuff. How do people learn more?
The easiest way, our website is pretty decent and usually has all of our info on it. So you can just go to neuromeditationinstitute.com, and we've got lists for our classes and our workshops, and we have a certification program for it's mostly therapists, other therapists who want to become certified in this style, but it's not always. In fact, we just had a yoga instructor the other day who is really keen on developing a yoga program based on the neuromeditation program. And so, we're figuring out how to sort of incorporate that and kind of create maybe a second wing for yoga instructors. So, we're still in a very much a growing part of our program right now. And, we anticipate having a lot more instructors and programs coming out. We're working on one for a trauma-informed neuromeditation program to come out very soon. And there's a peak performance neuromeditation program that has been slowly getting developed. We're working with a sports psychologist in California and another sports psychologist in West Virginia, and trying to kind of put that together. So anyway, people can go to the website and see what we're up to. We're located in Oregon, so if you're in Oregon, you can come check us out. Otherwise, we do travel around to offer workshops and trainings actually all over the country. And so people can find us there too.